Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who teach adults on Sunday morning at Dayspring. This video is designed to help you get ready as you prepare to teach a lesson this upcoming Sunday. The video you're watching is for those of you who are going to be teaching on Sunday, October the 5th, 2014 at Dayspring. So if that's you, go ahead and grab the teaching lesson that you've been sent and get it in front of you. Grab something to write with. I'm going to work through it with you and give you some thoughts to think about as you prepare to teach this lesson this week. All right, so go ahead and get that and let's look at it together. On page 1, you've got the overview of your lesson, which is is for you, the teacher, telling you what you're going to be teaching this week and what you're trying to communicate. Let me say this, that this lesson dovetails with the Sunday sermon, which we will study on the life of Noah. And as we look at the life of Noah in the worship service, we're going to be talking about the flood that is coming. Noah's account is a picture of what is to come. So there is a coming flood, and that flood, depending upon who you are, will either be a flood of judgment or a flood of salvation. So depending upon who you are and how you're positioned and related to Jesus will determine what that flood is like for you. Now, here's what we're going to be looking at for our purposes in this small group lesson. You're going to be teaching toward those who are followers of Jesus. And but here's the thing. Some who are Christians, even though they're followers of Jesus and they put their faith in Jesus, they still live with this dread of the future and a dread of this coming flood, so to speak. Now, here's the thing. Those who belong to Jesus yet dread what is coming in a fearful sense, it's one of two things. Either, number one, there's a lack of education in the sense that they don't know what that means and the future holds. They're just uninformed, so it scares them. Or, secondly, it could be that there is in their walk with God some things that are not healthy, that there are some things that are a part of their life where they're not following Jesus well. And what I've discovered is that when that happens, when someone is not walking with Jesus, it creates and fosters a sense of dread and fear, even in the flood of salvation that is to come. So what we're really doing in this lesson, you're teaching a lesson that's really aimed toward those who have put their faith and trust in Jesus. You're not talking toward those who it's going to be a flood of judgment because they've rejected Jesus. You're talking to those who've received Him. And what you're really trying to get at is this. How can we live in such a way that this coming flood that is coming, how can we live in such a way that we actually anticipate that and look forward to that? That there's a sense of expectation. That's where you're trying to head in this lesson. So, having said that, let's look at the actual teaching portion itself, which starts on page 2. This is the introduction to your lesson, excuse me. What you're doing here in this introduction is you're setting up, it kind of gives you some illustration type stuff, talking about if you've ever gotten a letter or a message that just, it wasn't positive and it really put the fear in you. This is setting up the passage that you're going to look at, because what you're going to look at is in Revelation chapter 3, a letter that was delivered to the Christians in a city called Sardis. And that letter was one of those kind of letters where you read it and you went, holy cow, and it woke you up. So you're setting up in the introduction the passage that you're going to teach through, which is Revelation chapter 3, the beginning verses, which is the letter that went out to the church in Sardis. Now let me say this. You may be thinking, holy cow, I'm teaching out of the book of Revelation. That scares me to death. Well, let me say this about what you're going to teach. You are actually teaching, and keep this in mind, you are teaching a letter that was delivered to a group of Christians. That's what think of it that way. This is a letter that went to a church in a particular city. So I know that the book of Revelation has a lot of imagery and a lot of things that you go, I don't even know what this is talking about, because you got dragon heads and all this stuff. This is the beginning of the book of Revelation, which is a little more tame. Okay, so keep this in mind that you're reading the letter to the church at Sardis. And here's what I would tell you to do. There's a great resource online that I've discovered that gives some really great historical background to the city of Sardis and the church in Sardis. So I would encourage you to look it up and read it, because it's going to give you a lot of information that I'm not going to take the time on this video to cover. But I think stuff that you would find very interesting and enlightening and would help you. So here's how you can find it. It can be found on Bible.org. Bible.org. You see it right there at the bottom of the screen. When you go to Bible.org, click on the search, little search section, and type in the word Sardis. Okay? So Bible.org, search for Sardis, and when you do that, it's going to have a bunch of different articles and things that are found on this website. Click on the one that's titled The Message to Sardis. It should be about the third one down on the list, I think. But Bible.org, you're going to search Sardis, and then look for the article written by Dr. Keithley called The Message to Sardis. I think you'll find in that a lot of great background information as well as teaching content that will give you a lot of confidence as you teach through this passage. So look that one up after this video, of course, and maybe print it out and see if there aren't some very helpful things that will supplement this lesson that you have. And you may even find some things in there that you would rather teach on that instead of this lesson. But really good stuff, okay? Now, so you've given the introduction to the lesson. Back to your teaching transcript here. You do the introduction, which talks about this. Have you ever gotten this dreadful letter that really got your attention and all of that? And then you segue into Revelation 3, where you say there were some Christians in Sardis who got this kind of letter. Then you move into the passage itself. Look at page 3 on your transcript. This is where we are now. At this point, you start teaching, or you read Revelation chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, which is the letter to the church at Sardis. Then you provide some of that background information. Now, there's a good bit of background for you on page 3, some of the same stuff that you would find on the Bible.org article. But here's some really good background that you can share with your folks. And I really encourage you to share the background information. You might say, well, I'm not really a historian and all of that, but this is one of those passages where the specific context of what they dealt with and what they lived with really brings to life what you're going to read in the Bible. So you'll share some background of the city. You may even do that before you read Revelation 3, 1 through 6. So you might just go ahead and paint the picture of life in Sardis in the first century, then move on to Revelation chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, and go from there. But from that point, you've got a 3-point outline that you're going to share. So let's look at it together, okay? Look at the bottom of page 3, which bleeds over into page 4. But here's your first point. You're going to point out in this letter, the sender and the recipient. Who wrote it, who received it. And both of these things are significant. Here's why. As it relates to the sender, your transcript shows you that the sender was Jesus himself. Now, when you read the letter, it doesn't spell that out. You kind of have to go back to the beginning of Revelation to figure out some of the code word. But this is a letter to the church in Sardis from Jesus himself. And I want you to think about this. If you knew that Jesus himself was telling you something, I mean, think about it. If in your own small group, if you had a guest speaker who came in and shared something with you, you would listen to it and you might receive it. And you might even live by their words of wisdom. But if it was Jesus himself who walked in and said, I've got something to share with you, I guarantee you, you would listen differently, you would take it in differently, you would receive it differently. And if he was saying things that challenged everything you ever thought, unlike just some stranger who, if they challenged everything you ever thought, you might dismiss that. But if Jesus himself was the one delivering the message, you would say, whoa, I'm going to listen to him, and I'm going to hear what he says, and even if it goes against everything I've ever thought, I'm going to listen to him. Well, that's what happens here. Jesus himself sends a letter. Now, that's the sender. How about the recipient? Well, you're going to see in this transcript, especially over on page 4, that the recipient goes out to, number 1, to the church, which means a body of people, a group of people. So this is a church to a y'all or an us kind of a letter. It's coming to us collectively, and you've got some teaching material as to why that matters. But secondly, it's also going out to individuals. He who has an ear, let him hear. So within the collective body, you've got a bunch of individuals. So The sender and the recipient of this letter matter because it comes from Jesus himself, which makes it very important. But secondly, it's coming to us, but it's also coming to me. So we need to hear this. When you're teaching this to your group, we need to hear this. But I can't hide behind the we. I need to hear this. So that's really the first point. Now that brings you to page 5, which is your second point. As it's talking to us and also to me, this letter points out both the problem and the solution. So here's a letter that comes out to the church of Sardis, both them collectively and individually, and it points out a problem. Now, their problem reminds me of something funny I saw back in the 10th grade. I was over at Satsuma High School in geometry class, and there was a guy in my class who one day we discovered something about him, that he could sit in class with his eyes open, yet he was asleep. And the way we discovered it is because one day the teacher called on him to answer a math question, and we're all looking over at him, and we think he's looking at her, but this joker was sound asleep. He looked awake, but he wasn't. Now, here's what we're going to find out in this letter to the Christians in Sardis. That's how God describes them. He says, you look like you're wide awake, you look like you're full of life, but you're not what you appear to be. So here was their problem. I would break down their problem twofold, all right? And you'll see this in the passage. Number one, their problem was they really weren't alive, or you might say awake, but they really weren't alive. And secondly, they weren't clean. Now, as you study through some of that historical background of the city of Sardis and some of the worship rituals that they had before they became Christians, you'll see why it matters that they're being called not clean and wearing the wrong kind of robes and that kind of stuff. But this is what I would say about the church in Sardis. They were not alive, that's in verses 1 through 3, and they were not clean, verses 4 through 6. Now let me say something about both of those things that are not in your teaching transcript, okay? As it relates to not being alive, I want you to look up some things that Jesus said, in particular, when he came into conflict with the religious leaders. Because basically he's going to tell them the same thing. You're not alive and you're not clean. You're dead and you're unclean. Now here's some things to look up. As it relates to them being not alive, look up what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 23. I believe it's verses 27 and 28. Look up those verses to what Jesus says to the people that he's saying you're not alive. As it relates to what Jesus says, and again, if you didn't get that, that's Matthew 23, 27, and 28. As it relates to Jesus telling those same people that they were not clean, look up these verses. Matthew 23, it's the same passage, verses 25 and 26. Matthew 23, 25 and 26. Also look up Matthew 15. Matthew 15, verses 1 through 3, 7 through 11, and 17 through 20. So, as it relates to not being clean, that's Matthew 23, 25 and 26, Matthew 15, 1 through 3, 7 through 11, and 17 through 20. Now, as you read through those things, and here Jesus is telling a group, you're not even awake, you're not even clean. What you're going to discover is that what Jesus was getting at is this, is that being alive and being clean, that those are not outside things. They're not external things in terms of how we look and how we come across, because that was the whole thing with the religious leaders. Think about it. They had all of these external things that they were committed to, and they did. And as you read through the Gospel of Matthew, you'll see that they did the right kind of prayers. They participated in the right kind of meals. They worshipped on the right day at the right time. They performed the right kinds of rituals. They offered the right kinds of sacrifices and tithes. All of those external things, all of which, by the way, I think are good things to participate in. When you're talking about praying and making sacrifices and all of that. The religious leaders did every bit of that. Yet here's Jesus saying, you're not alive and you're not clean. So my point is this. Because we're talking about on page 5 here, the problem and the solution for this church in Sardis. Here's the problem. When the outside is more impressive than the inside, that's a problem. When what's on the outside of us is more impressive than what's on the inside of us, I believe that Jesus would look at us and say, "No, there's a problem here. There's a problem." And this was the problem for the church in Sardis. Now, the solution is spelled out in the verses that you're studying. Basically, Jesus tells them, he said, you need to wake up and you need to strengthen what remains. Now, when Jesus said you need to wake up, this would have struck a chord with the people of Sardis. And this is spelled out on page 6 under the third point in your outline. The third point in your outline talks about the consequence and the commendation. In other words, when Jesus is talking to this group of people, he says, for some of you, I'm coming up to you. I'm coming to you. I'm showing up. And for some of you, that's a bad thing. For some of you, it's a good thing. And that's what connects this whole lesson with what we're talking about. Jesus is returning. He's coming back. And for some of us, we say, man, I cannot wait till this flood comes. But there are others who are going to say, oh, he's coming. I just don't feel ready. So even within the Christian community, you find some who this is a good thing, some who feel as if it's a bad thing. And for our purposes in this lesson, in dealing with believers, this is what we're trying to get at. How can we live in such a way that there is an expectation and an eagerness of the return of Jesus, where when he comes back in the flood of his return, how can we live in such a way that we say, I'm looking forward to this and I want this? And the answer is in being faithful to God and obeying him. When we are faithful and obey, when we are following in his footsteps, we will find that that does something to us. It changes everything as it relates to our expectation of his return. So this is really kind of a diagnostic lesson. If I'm living in such a way, and I'm convinced that I'm a follower of Jesus, that's not up for debate. I'm not wondering whether or not I belong to him. I know that I belong to him. But if I know that I belong to him, yet I still feel an anxiety about his return, that tells me something about maybe some areas of disobedience in my life that I need to correct. Because when I do correct them, I will find that my heart begins to long for his return and expect it and anticipate it in a positive way. So that's what this lesson is all about. All right. From there on, you've got your application moment on page 7 with the handout that comes with it on page 9 with your group. And by the way, this week, that handout, you'll notice sometimes in your handout that you distribute to your group members, sometimes you'll notice that handout has particular verbiage that is part of your lesson. So if you don't teach the lesson as it comes in the transcript, sometimes the handout is referring to things that maybe you could have said or should have said that will help the handout make sense. You'll notice in this lesson, the handout doesn't use the same terminology that your teaching transcript does. So if you end up changing the terminology a little bit or changing the wording or all of that, it's not going to interfere with the handout portion of your class time, okay? But you've got the application moment in the group handout, and then on page 8, you've got a conclusion to the lesson. And as always, you can conclude, if you need to, just by pointing to the memory verse so that you'll have a good, clean last statement that gives you an I'm done kind of a feel to the lesson. All right? But this is the lesson. I hope that it's helpful to you. Don't forget the Bible.org resource, okay? So that's Bible.org. Search for Sardis, and then look for the article called The Message to Sardis, written by the old professor, Dr. Keithley, okay? Thanks for listening in on this. I hope that it gave you some things to think about and will help you get ready to teach this lesson on Revelation 3 to the church in Sardis. God bless you. Going to be a great Sunday. We'll see you then.